This is Ship It with Justin Garrison and Autumn Nash, a podcast about everything that happens after Git Push. Ship It is brought to you by Fly.io, the home of changelog.com. Launch your apps close to your users all around the world. Learn how at Fly.io.
What's up, friends? I'm here with a new friend of mine, Jasmine Cassis, product manager at Sentry. She's been doing some amazing work, her and her teams, over many years being at Sentry, and her latest thing is just awesome. User feedback. You can now enable a widget on the front end of your website powered by Sentry that captures user feedback. Jasmine, tell me about this feature.
Well, I'm Jasmine. I am a product manager at Sentry, and I'm approaching my 3-year anniversary. So I've spent a lot of time here. I work on various different customer-facing products. More recently, I've been focused on this user feedback widget feature, but I've also worked on Session Replay and our dashboards product. With user feedback, I am particularly excited about that. We launched that a few weeks ago. Essentially, what it allows you to do is it makes it very easy to connect the developer to the end user, your customer. So you can immediately hear from basically who you're building for your audience. And you can basically have a good understanding of a wide range of bugs. So Sentry automatically detects things like performance problems and exceptions, but there are other bugs that can happen on your website, such as broken links or a typo or a permission problem. And that is where the user feedback widget comes in, and it captures that additional 20% of bugs that may not be automatically captured. I think that's why it's so special. And what takes it a step level above these other feedback tools and these support tools that you see is that when you get those feedback messages, they're connected to Sentry's rich debugging context and telemetry. Because often, I've seen it myself, I read a lot of user feedback. Messages are cryptic. They're not descriptive enough to really understand the problem the user is facing. So what's great about user feedback is we connect it to our replay product, which basically shows what the user was doing at that moment in time, right before reporting that bug. And we also connect it to things such as screenshots. So we created the capability for a user to upload a screenshot so they could highlight something specific on the page that they're referring to. So it kind of removes the guesswork for what exactly is this feedback submission or bug report referring to.
Now, I don't know about you, but I have wanted something like this on the front end pretty much since forever. And the fact that it ties into Session Replay, ties into all your tracing, ties into all of the things that Sentry does to make you a better developer and to make your application more performant and amazing. It's just amazing. You can learn more by going to Sentry.io. That's SENTRY.io. And when you get there, go to the product tab and click on user feedback. That will take you to the landing page for user feedback. Dive in, learn all you can. Use our code changelog to get $100 off the team plan for free. Now, what she didn't mention was that user feedback is given to everyone. So if you have a Sentry account, you have user feedback. So go and use it. If you're already a user, go and get it on your front end. And if you're not a user, well then, hey, use the code changelog, get $100 off the team plan for 3-ish months, almost 4 months. Once again, Sentry.io.
Hello and welcome to Ship It, the podcast all about what happens after you Git push. I'm your host, Justin Garrison, and with me as always is Autumn Nash. How's it going, Autumn?
Good, how are you?
I hear it's humid right now in Seattle.
We're not used to sun. I mean, I don't know if it's humid versus other places, but it's 78 today. and it is.
But you have
hot.
like 6 weeks of sunlight, right? You need to take advantage.
I'm a vampire. I'm like, oh my god, outside there's like sun.
I guess if you want clouds most of the year, when it comes out, you have to kind of acclimate back into it.
Yeah.
For today's show, we have Gareth Greenaway, who is a core maintainer for the SALT program, a configuration management program, open source, written in Python. And so we talked to him all about, we kind of went all over the place, which was fun. It was started off with like how to get started, and then into like open source and how corporations do open source and foundations and all sorts of stuff.
Gareth is one of the nicest people. He is, for all the cool things that he's done, he's just really like humble, you know? Like he doesn't talk down to people like, oh,
well, except for the fact that he's like 6'7".
Okay, he talks down like in a literal way, but not a like smart people way. Every time, like when I was standing next to him at scale, I was like, you are so very tall. Like,
Yeah.
He's a very kind, tall person.
Exactly. And like when I first met him, it was very welcoming. Just being able to talk to him and just sit down and like talk about anything really. It's like, oh, is technology cool? Yeah, maybe. But like, what else are you doing? Right. Like, it's just, he's very approachable and fun. Yeah.
Yes. Like he's one of those people who's like a legit dope human, and not just for like his technical contributions, like the actual just being a good human that happens to be smart. And I think like people like him are what make the Kubernetes like system Linux area a really cool community.
Yeah, for sure. And having him like involved in conferences and just being available like in places that I've seen him. He lives in SoCal, so I've seen him around at meetups and whatnots over the years because we've both been in the area for so long. That it's always nice to see is like, oh, if Gareth is there, then this is probably a pretty good community. Because I also know that
dude, that is so true. Like there's some people that you know that are like little beacons of light in tech. And if they're involved, you probably want to be there in that room or at that conference. Even when I'm like looking for conferences to speak at or to book or whatever, when there's certain people there, like half the time I'm like, I'm gonna just go to Render and I don't even do JavaScript, but I know who's gonna show up, you know? Like, so it's like,
man, I had so much FOMO from Render. I wish I was
the
there.
Render FOMO was real. It was so real. Like,
I do zero. Well, I do some JavaScript, but I do not do it with a smile on my face. But I wanted to be a part of that community and be in Atlanta. It looked amazing. So let's go ahead and jump into the interview with Gareth, and then we will talk to everyone after. All right, welcome to the show, Gareth Greenaway. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
it's a Scale reunion.
Gareth, you and I have known each other for a little while now, because just through the Scale conference, right? Like we met, I don't know how long ago.
Yeah, it's been a while. I forget what, I think your first Scale was like Scale
9?
9. Okay.
8 or 9? Yeah, somewhere there.
I usually think of them in terms of like where the Scale event happened, like what venue it was. And that's kind of how I gauge like, okay, that's how long ago it was. That's how long I've known this person.
I was at the Westin, so I don't remember which version that was, but it was a while ago.
Yeah, that was probably 9. That sounds about right.
Yeah, it was somewhere in there. But I know I don't like that the Scale conferences don't line up with years. That still always throws me off. That like 9 wasn't in 2009, because I always think of it as somewhere around that time, but it's like 1 or 2 years off.
Yeah, originally it was supposed to be. So the very first Scale was in November. I want to say 2021. It was at the USC Davidson Conference Center.
2001.
I believe it was 2001. Yeah. But for whatever reason, we decided to shift to earlier in the year for the next one. So we basically had like a year gap between the next one. So the next one I don't believe happened until like possibly 2023, but it was early 2023. But again, like, yeah.
You're saying extra 20s in there, because that was last year, 2023.
Oh, no, sorry.
2003.
2003. Yeah.
So let's start with what software are you responsible for, or have you been responsible for?
So up until January of this year, I was a member of the Salt core team. So previously, like a lot of people will probably know it as Salt Stack. That was the original name of the project and the company that was kind of behind the project. So I was working for Salt Stack, the company, and then we were acquired by VMware. So I was continuing to kind of work on and maintain the Salt project. And then Broadcom decided to buy VMware. and let go a majority of the team that I was on, including myself. So I unfortunately am no longer one of the core maintainers of the Salt project as of January.
How did you get involved? Like what started you going down, like why Salt? Like what were you doing?
I was working as a DevOps engineer at a small company, and we were using Puppet for a lot of our automation and our deployments and whatnot. And a friend of mine had mentioned this new project that he was involved with, or had kind of started using, called Salt. And I kind of looked at it. It was really early days. Like they had 3 to 4 months into like actually the actual start of the project, and it was really. It didn't work, for lack of a better word. It didn't work. It was really early. So then fast forward like a few months, maybe like 6 months later, I was actually one of the rotating co-hosts for a podcast called Floss Weekly. And we had 2 guests kind of like back to back that I was the co-host for. One of them was the founder, the guy that started Ansible. And so we like did the interview, learned about Ansible, and some fun questions. And then kind of I started playing around with Ansible a little bit. I was like, yeah, this is kind of interesting. A week or 2 later, we interviewed the founder, the guy that started Salt. And afterwards, I kind of like, I started playing around with it again. And again, like I was familiar with it. So I had looked at it early on, but it wasn't quite there. And so this time around, like I kind of started exploring it more. And it had made like significant strides since I'd last looked at it. I just started kind of playing around with it. One of the things I noticed early on was that I was running through the tutorial of how to use it. And one of the things that it walked you through kind of like initially was like setting up networking, I think it was. And I was like, okay, let's walk through this. And it wasn't working for whatever reason. And I realized it was because no one had written the support for the operating system that I was using, that I was trying to test it with. But it wasn't obvious. It wasn't like came back saying like, oh, you're using Ubuntu. Like it's not going to work. So once I discovered that, I was like, okay, what would it take to kind of add support for Ubuntu into, or Debian it was, into like Salt in order to be able to do this? So it turned out it was fairly easy. But this was actually my first contribution to the project. And I believe when I left, it still held the record for the most lint errors of any like Python contribution. If you don't know, like lint is like checking formatting, checking like you have the right number of spaces or tabs or whatever. And my lint error count was something like, I think it was like a 200 line contribution, and it had something like 500 lint errors.
It's impressive, actually.
Can you tell us more about what Salt is? Like kind of like just a brief summary, so that way in case somebody hasn't used it before.
Yeah, it's a good question. So Salt is it's often categorized in like I mentioned Ansible. It's put in the same category as tools like Ansible and Chef and Puppet, or CF Engine, like if you go way back. It is so like those tools are often referred to as like configuration management systems. So if you want to perform the same task across like many different systems, say you have like tens of hundreds or thousands of systems, rather than going to each individual one and doing the same task over and over again manually, a configuration management system allows you to define your rules, define your configuration once, and then apply it across the board to all those systems fairly easily. So Salt is a configuration management system, but it's also a remote execution system. So in addition to the configuration management, you can also run commands outside of configuration management. So like rather than Salt uses YAML as its default states, they're called. Like with Puppet, it's manifests, and Chef, it's recipes. Salts are states. And the states are written in YAML.
And Ansible is YOLOs, right?
Yeah, Ansible is YOLOs.
Is it really called YOLOs?
No, it should be.
Okay.
It feels like it every time
See, one-liners. This proves that just
Ansible is playbooks.
Playbooks, that's what it's called. That's right.
Yeah, so beyond that configuration management, it's got the remote execution portion of it, which allows you to just run, say you want to run an RM command, like remove a particular file off like 100 different servers, rather than go and like, okay, I want to define a YAML thing that runs this command. You can just run the commands across all of the systems. So think of it like back in the day, we used to, if we wanted to do that, you'd write like a for loop and
SSH in a for loop, baby. That's it.
SSH in a for loop, exactly.
End up in bash hell forever.
Yes.
I remember my exposure to it back in the day. Like I was looking at puppets at my first sysadmin job and I got puppet trained and everything. I was deploying it. I was like, I need to deploy this faster. And then I went with Ansible because I'm like, oh, I can SSH in to all these boxes and install Puppet. And so I had like I had an Ansible playbook, an Ansible YOLO as they're called now, that would deploy Puppet for me. But then Puppet didn't have a way to like do those executions. They had mCollective, which was like a bolt on. It was a config management thing that would then do like this like message bus sidecar thing that's like, oh, you could also do this other thing. But like Salt was the other way. It was like Salt was an remote execution, really fast remote execution, high scalable remote execution environment, but also could do configuration management stuff. And Ansible felt somewhere in the middle where it's like, oh, SSH is there. It's just kind of like a convenience factor that it was mainly a remote execution over SSH and you could like shove these playbooks in, but it was super slow. And it was like, once you get over like a few hundred servers, you're kind of like, I'm not waiting for SSH for this. Like all that back and forth. And the Salt 0MQ, I don't know if it's 0MQ, but it was at the time. Like message bus was just so fast. And like at multiple jobs, I ended up doing, I think that job I had Puppet, I had Ansible deploy Puppet and then Puppet deploy Salt so I could do remote execution because mCollective was terrible. And even at another job, we had Puppet in place and we actually had Salt trigger a local only, what do they call it? The client side only apply because Puppet wouldn't scale in the back end because all the manifests were compiled on the servers and to scale those servers was really annoying. So it's like, I love that Salt did that on the clients already. So I was a big fan. And I also liked writing Python more than Ruby. Were you doing development in Python beforehand before you started getting involved with Salt, or was that like you're learning as you go?
I had done a few like little side projects using Python, mostly just if I needed to write some scripts or write something like a simple tool and kind of gone beyond the capabilities of Bash. I would turn to Python, but contributing to Salt was really my first kind of exposure to really writing large like Python projects.
Yeah. There's a big difference when you like, oh, I have this script that's a few hundred lines. And then you're like, oh, no, I'm writing libraries that get imported and do all this other stuff and compile together.
Yeah. I mean, it's especially different too when you're writing stuff that you are the only consumer versus you're writing stuff that hundreds and thousands of people are using and relying on. There was a moment, this was after I joined the company, and I think we used to do like a yearly conference, hilariously called SaltConf, obviously.
SaltConf.
And I was sitting with one of my coworkers, I think during the keynote one morning. It was like these big companies were coming and like talking about like their reliance on the software that we were writing. And I just turned to her and I said, like, this is like a Fortune like 500 company that's using the software that we're writing. I said, like, that is awesome. And at the same time, it's terrifying.
There's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
Now, joining the company, because pretty much every config management product started as like, I could do this thing and we're going to open source it and it's just going to be fun. And then people are like, I need to pay for support because my production's running on this. And so all of them that I know of, Chef, Puppet, Salt, Ansible, all started as independent companies based on around a project. And then all of them got bought by another big company who, for whatever reasons, it's not making enough money, didn't continue it, whatever. Like all of them kind of floundered, in my opinion, in whatever parent company they had. Why did you decide to join a company based around an open source project?
I mean, before I joined, that really wasn't happening as much as it has recently. Actually, like, it's funny when you were describing kind of the progression of the various tools. I was thinking of the history a little different. The very first one I remember, like I kind of mentioned it early on, was CF Engine, and I remember seeing and reading about the reason that Puppet came about was because the person that started Puppet was trying to get contributions into CF Engine and they weren't getting into it. So he was just like, screw you guys, I'm going to go do my own thing. And then years later, the person that started Chef, it was a similar thing. He wanted some changes put into Puppet in order for like some of the work he was doing. and got a similar reaction. Like, no, that's not the direction we want to go with.
Well, it's the
Puppet.
same way with
So-
Ansible, right? Like Luke worked
Exactly,
at Puppet,
yes.
and I think Michael started Ansible. He was working at Puppet, and Luke was like, "Oh, this
Yep.
isn't SSH in a for loop," and he's like, "Yes, it is," and I'll show you. It's Ansible was born. Yeah,
Yeah, and the same thing happened with Salt as well. Like Tom Hatch, the person that created Salt originally, he was originally contributing to Puppet as well. And it was like, oh, this isn't doing what I wanted to do. I want a remote execution system. So he went off and wrote one. But back to your original question about like the companies, the reason I joined was like, hey, I had this opportunity to work on open source software and contribute to a project that I use and love. And I wasn't even thinking of like, oh, okay, at some point this company might get acquired by another company that would basically like kind of shelve the project. Because most companies that, if it was happening, like a good example is when Red Hat bought Ansible, they didn't simply shelve the project. It was just like, okay, this is great. We're gonna keep using it. We're gonna bake it into like a lot of our other software. And even when originally no one bought Puppet, if I remember right, Puppet went public, so everyone like celebrated because it's like, oh, a company went public, we made millions. And then later, like someone bought it and was just kind of like, okay, we're going to do some nefarious things with this project that are not so open sourcey. So yeah, I mean, I didn't even think about that.
Usually acquisitions pay off for small companies, but now we're kind of in this weird. How do you think this affects open source going forward, though, and how we get people to contribute and, join these companies? Because 70% of open source, 70% of infrastructure is open source, right? And the companies and teams need these things to make their jobs easier. But how do we get people to contribute and join these companies and make that risk if this is possibly their future? And how do we get companies and how do us as like engineers and teams trust open source when we don't know if you're going to fire half of the team that we depend on? Like, because, when you bake in dependencies to a large architecture, all of a sudden you are now married to that. So if you are like, this product's awesome and I love using it, it's going to make my life so much easier, and then all of a sudden somebody cans it in 2 years and it's still running in your production, and now you have to figure out what you do with it. Like, how does this affect software going forward?
One of the nice things that's kind of baked into the idea of like, oh, like once a project is open source, it's always open source as long as there's people there to maintain it, to keep it going. So even if a company no longer, if they try and like make a project no longer open source, the community itself can fork that project and run with it. I mean, we've seen an example of that with Terraform. Like HashiCorp tried to change their license, or did change their license, and then OpenTofu, the community was like, we don't agree with that, we're going to fork and make OpenTofu. I mean, where it gets complicated is when the lawyers at HashiCorp then got involved and said, like, you're stealing our code, simply because it was similar enough that they thought they had taken the code.
Which is going to get complicated because there's only so many ways you can do things.
Exactly, yeah.
The rebuttal to that was fire. Like no, this code was open source before you changed the license. You can't re-change this license and then come sue us. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Yo, that was open source tea right there. I got coffee. I sat there and read it, and I was like, well, because it's gonna set a precedent, right?
Yeah.
Like, from now on, every time somebody goes and license something that was open source, these things didn't happen before, and all of a sudden, like, the more this happens, this is going to become the playbook of like, either how do you fight back, how do you keep something open source, how does it forked? So it's almost like we're watching like the new revolution of open source and how it's going to survive in this new environment.
I mean, one of the things that I've thought about since being let go from VMware and watching kind of the progression of what's happening with the project that I used to work on is whether or not corporations, whether or not companies themselves should be the sole owner of a project. I mean, Justin mentioned like all of the kind of configuration, all the tools in the configuration management space kind of formed companies around them. And only a couple of them still exist today because the companies eventually got bought out, and then the companies that bought them out shelved them. So I've started to think like whether or not the company itself should be the sole owner of like a project. Well, I'm not saying like it necessarily needs to be a foundation, because foundations I think have their own sort of problems. Not naming any names specifically.
But I think that's like a big thing you're pointing out here, especially like both the pieces that you talk about here are like, we could talk about Broadcom with the open source SALT project is like, hey, if this gets shelved or put on maintenance mode or doesn't get, like, many people can survive on it for a very, very long time, and that's fine. And if they need to, they can fork it and they can start from whatever the last open source thing is. The other side of that is VMware, like the actual like hypervisor, like the closed source thing.
I was gonna say that's like the littlest part of their problem. Like there's so many different problems there.
Right. And like that's the other, like the benefit of having something open source of like, hey, I can still see this code and I can fork it, versus I have no access to this thing. Like, I, instead of being locked in, you're locked out. Right. Like you're like, I can't do anything. And that's how compilers used to work. That's how a lot of stuff used to work. It was all private. It was not open source. And then we moved into this thing should be open source at this layer. And we kind of ignored some of those pieces like VMware. And in my opinion, current cloud providers, right? Like there's nothing open source about GCP.
Yeah, but it's wild though. But it's wild because you can see the way that new startups are starting to build it. They're building things that are easier to lift and shift. Like that was a complete, Google Next was full of talks in different startups that were making it, for one, being able to monitor multi-cloud, you know, and to be able to do the same, I guess, system work in multiple clouds at the same time, and to be able to monitor it properly was the bulk of the startups. I mean, unless you're talking about AI, but like interesting startups, that was the bulk of it, right?
Well, I mean, GCP gets some benefit about telling people multi-cloud is easy. Right?
Well, no, but I mean, like,
as the smallest major cloud provider, they want you to come move to them.
Like people that are building these startups, that is the new solution that they are trying to, like, you know what I mean? I'm not saying GCP specifically, but it seems like that is the new subject that people are trying to account for because they're not sure what to do when it comes to cloud and on-prem and what they want to go back and forth with, or even just like what they're using, right? So now they're kind of trying to find a way to like build their hatch door of like, in case they have to escape. So it's like,
well, and there's new layers that have exposed, like containers was a big change with configuration management, with infrastructure, as like, oh, I have this portable artifact that can run more places, and Kubernetes being the new VMware to some extent of like, hey, this is portable across these cloud environments. Like, I mean, to a lot of degree, like OpenStack was probably just a little too OpenStack was just a little too early, right? Like it was just like, hey, you know what, like this might come around again. But it didn't work for a lot of reasons. But going back to Gareth, what you were saying about like foundations versus companies, one of the things that I think that we are beyond the point of independent projects becoming large is because of the legal problems as well, right? Like foundations are there to also help protect against the legal aspects of like, oh, someone's going to sue me if I start a project and someone sues me for it. Like, I forget it. Like, I don't have any funds or any time to do this, to defend myself. I just have to shut it down or say, okay, yeah, you're right. Never mind. I don't care.
One thing that seems to be working really well is when multiple big companies join foundations to contribute.
Well, that's the only way they can join a project, right? Like that was like,
but I'm saying like it seems like they're more successful when like there's multiple big voices in the room, you know?
Yes, and they have to have a third party to say the same voice. Like the reason CNCF exists is because Google and Red Hat wanted to work on this on Kubernetes together. Right? Like it's like, oh, they're never going to get their lawyers on the same page to say like, oh, we're going to do this together. Like, oh, let's just actually make a foundation. CNCF was created, and then we can get more companies to join, and the CNCF owns that legal responsibility and trademarks and all that other stuff.
But it seems like the way that we can contribute to get open source funded and contribute to get people to work on it like full time, and you know, and but also it keeps it where one company can't come and eat the entire thing, you know, like there's more of like a community or board, or you know, maintainers have to be able to all agree on the features, whether that works well or, you know, politically.
and there's problems with all those models, right?
But it seems like it's the one that keeps, I don't know, power equally distributed more, sort of.
I just watched the Node.js documentary.
There's a documentary on
YouTube. It was really, I know almost nothing about Node.js. I knew none of the drama, none of the stuff. And it was really about Joyent, the company, owned Node.js as the trademark, as the project, and they were not doing what they should have been doing to maintain that. And a lot of people wanted to, so they forked it. And then Joyent's like, hold on, wait, look, we want to actually still own this. And they ended up in the end, having a foundation and putting the trademark and everything else in this foundation. Is like, hey, it's a third party, but it's all came around open governance. Gareth, where do you think that fits in as this project company sort of balance? Why might that be important over just an open source license for code?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I was thinking about when you and Autumn were just talking about some of the things around foundations, right? I mean, Justin, you mentioned the CNCF and kind of the Google and Red Hat wanted to work together on Kubernetes, and like otherwise without like kind of a third party there, they wouldn't have been able to do that. But one of the things I was thinking about in terms of governance, I think one of the things that's most important about it is ensuring that everyone is on a level playing field. So like using Google and Red Hat, for example, if they're within like the same foundation, they're two massive companies. And if you have a third company that's not as massive, they should also have an equal say in the direction of that project. It shouldn't be simply an opportunity for Google and Red Hat or IBM or whoever else is out there to simply say like, okay, no, we're the 800-pound gorilla now. We're going to have our say in this. It should be equal, like an equal footing, allowing everyone to kind of ensure the benefit of the project, not simply the benefit to the project for the 800-pound gorilla.
I don't know enough about some of the foundations to know like how that's actually played out. I know with CNCF, like even with Kubernetes early days, like it's hit 10 years old this year, and we're still ripping out stuff that's like GCP specific, right? Like there's still a lot of like back end of Kubernetes that's like only works in Google because Google had the infrastructure to run it. And they're like, oh, we're just going to run these tests on our infrastructure because we have employees dedicated to it. And if Google had said they weren't interested anymore, I don't know what would happen to all that infrastructure and all those tests. Like it still costs, like I'm a part of like the SIG infra, like it's millions of dollars a year of hosted resources that have to run tests and validate things for something like you said, Gareth, is code that lots and lots of companies depend on. And you can't just like throw that out there and say like, oh, well, it's some Python with some linting errors. I don't care. It's like, no, you have to validate this stuff if you want to gain that trust.
That's one of the interesting things that I've noticed over the course of like my interest, my involvement in the open source community at large, is how it shifted from I mean, one example that I often go to is Apache, like one of the most probably popular, most prevalent web servers in the world at this point. And just thinking like I think it was a long time before the people that actually worked on it were paid to work on it. It was very much a hobbyist project.
Yeah.
And in order, like if you wanted to go and like download and install Apache, you would go to a website or an FTP site somewhere, and you would go and like download the package, you'd unpack it, you'd like do all your stuff. Now we have projects, not necessarily Apache, but I'm sure they fit into this realm as well. We have projects, as you said, they have infrastructure bills that are millions of dollars. I know, like when we were maintaining Salt, when I was still part of the group maintaining Salt, we would have AWS bills that were in like the tens of thousands of dollars every month. Sometimes, like I think the max we hit was probably something like pushing like $40,000 just for
and that's
running
just overhead,
tests, just to test. Exactly. Yeah, and that's not even like hosting costs. That's not even like salaries.
You're not making money from that. That's
No.
the cost of doing business, right?
Exactly.
I actually, you actually, as I was watching the Node.js documentary, like I was thinking, any listeners know, I want to talk to people that run like a large-ish repo management, like apt. Like what's the back end of app? Like I want to talk to them that what are you running your web servers on? And some people from NPM, right? Like what's the back end of that? Like I love hearing from that side because not only is that interesting just as like a large web scaling problem, but also from like a getting started in open source. When people are like, hey, how do I get started? I don't have job experience. I'm like, go find the open source project that hosts a repo somewhere that has a service, because not a lot of open source projects have services, but some definitely do. Kubernetes, a lot of these package managers, they're all out there and they all run a web server or web servers with caching and all this stuff. And you have to learn that. And that is absolutely on the job training, but it's open source and you get the money for free. If you want to join SIG infrastructure for Kubernetes, you can come join and you get access. I mean, you have to gain some trust, but like it's millions of dollars of infrastructure spend. I was like, that is on the job, like hands-on experience that actually has financial responsibility. Even if you're not paid for it, you can get experience in those areas, which I think is really fascinating.
And that is, I mean, that's one thing that is, for the longest time, like if you wanted, like a good example, a good way to get experience, a good way to like get something like a bullet point on your resume was contributing to an open source project. But most of those contributions were code. Like it was just like, okay, your only avenue into contributing to an open source project was code. And so it's good to see like other ways that people who aren't necessarily either like prolific, I'm not going to use that word,
Prolific,
aren't good at writing code or not interested in writing code to contribute to those projects, either through infrastructure or through documentation or through testing. Because there's other, like the people have other interests, and it's good to see like the projects kind of adopting ways for those people to contribute as well.
I've talked to so many people over the years about trying to get into tech, and they're like, I need to have like a open source project to like show off I can code. I'm like, no, you don't. Like go find a popular-ish project and go contribute to it.
But guys, do you think that's still a thing though? Because like people who are like impressive developers are having a hard time getting jobs right now.
Oh, it's not a for sure thing at all.
Well, not a for sure thing, but is it still a thing, right? Like nothing's for sure, but you know what I mean? And also like it's hard to get into open source. Like
it takes time.
Open source, not even time, but people like it's hard to get people to take you seriously and to be able to find an environment where you can learn, you know, like where people are willing to let you like make mistakes and to teach you or to like get like so you can get in there. Like you can't just magically start contributing to crazy infrastructure.
I mean, if I want to do woodworking, like what are my options to go learn woodworking? Like if YouTube didn't exist, right? Like I would just go trial and error in my garage, like cutting some wood. I'm like, oh, that didn't work. And I'd learn pretty much all the wrong ways to do it and rehash a lot of stuff. What I usually recommend for people getting into an open source project is like, go do one contribution to the docs, because they all love doc contributions. And you're going to learn if the community is welcoming, if there's someone that can help you, and how much resources they have available to help you get started. Like, hey, I want to make this change. Where the heck is that in the code base, right? Like you have to go find it. You have to learn how to do Git, all this stuff. You might have to do code signing. All that stuff is a side of like, oh, I just need to make a one-line change to a documentation and then go contribute and then figure out if you want to stick around, figure out if the community's welcoming, if someone's helping you learn, if you're growing, if you still want to do it. And I've done, I don't know how many projects, like just individual documentation updates throughout my life of like, you know what? I don't want to be in this community because I didn't have a good experience with that. And that's fine.
Do you think the way things are going with open source right now, would you do anything differently about your start in open source and the amount of contributions? And like, I mean, you're in scale, like I'd also love to know how you got into Scale, like and how you got involved, but like you've contributed so much of your life to open source and the way it's going, like would you do the same things again? And like, what is your outlook on where open source is going?
Yeah, I think I probably would. I can't think of anything as far as my contributions or my involvement that I would change. One thing I wanted to say, kind of to your point, and one of the things that Justin said that I think is most important when you're looking for, like, how do you get involved, is looking to see what communities, what projects are welcoming. Because there is, unfortunately, a lot out there that are not. I don't necessarily think that they are unwelcoming on purpose. I think it's just the way that the project is structured and the people that it's made up of.
There are definitely some like communities that are like not warm and fuzzy.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, and that comes down to like the people that are leading those projects. I mean, there's like the Linux kernel is infamous for not being necessarily a welcoming community. And that stems from the top, from Linus himself.
There's a lot of old grouchy people killing the vibes of open source, but it's wild because from a person that's never been to Scale before, who's never used Kubernetes, the community at Scale and Kubernetes and the people that I've met, I so badly want to join the SIG release team or somehow find a way to contribute because I want to be around those people. And I think that may eventually set open source projects apart, because when one community makes you just want to hang out with these people and want to be a part of something, if you're working for free, you're going to pick the people that make you want to show and that are willing to teach you and that make you want to show up and do it. And it is amazing, the community that you guys have created.
The Kubernetes community at large, because I think there's many sub-communities within that community at large, but I would say they are probably one of the most welcoming, friendly community out there. There was a comment that I made to a few people. I made it a couple times. It was more of like a question. When we were all at Scale this past year, either the week before or the week after Scale, there was supposed to be a KubeCon event in Paris. And a lot of people missed Scale because they were going to KubeCon. A lot of people were leaving Scale right after to go to KubeCon. And so I posed the question to like some people a couple of times of like, how many people do you think are going to KubeCon because they're actively using Kubernetes, they're actively contributing to Kubernetes, or they just want to go to KubeCon to hang out with like people that are using Kubernetes? And a few people kind of like, I don't know, took the question kind of not the way I intended it. Like, well, why shouldn't they go to KubeCon? And I was like, no. I'm it's a genuine question because I want to know how many people are going because they're actively using Kubernetes, or how many people are going simply because they like the vibe of hanging out with people in the Kubernetes community.
No, honestly, as someone who's never touched Kubernetes in their life, like if I can find the time and if somebody had a project, I would literally contribute to it. And it would be one of with all the things that I have to do, it would be something that would motivate me to still want to fit that extra time into my day because of the community I met at Scale.
I think that's wraps up a lot of this too, where back in the day, open source, you would do it because it was fun, and you would find people that were having fun on the internet and they were welcoming, and you would go join them.
And you're tech is not fun right now.
and there's a lot has changed because it has shifted from this like, wow, I'm just hanging out at night having fun hacking on something, to I'm working for a company for free.
That's true, because think about what we were talking about with Rich and the even other like episodes. It was stuff that people just did in their free time, and they're like, oh my god, I
had fun. You're scratching your own itch, you're learning something, and you're just hanging out having fun, and you become friends. And I have so many internet friends from projects over the years. I'm just like, wow, no, we had fun online.
Someone on Twitter said their wife asked them if it was their real friend or their internet friend, and he was like, what do you mean? Like,
oh no, I have a code for this.
So hard.
No, with my wife, I call any internet friend, if I haven't met them in person, they're a friendly versus a friend. And so I have to
see, this proves Justin's one-liners.
We need to tell me if you know this person in physical person, like in meet space, and you've known them, or they're just someone you met online. I'm like, well, like I've known them for a long time. I've known them online, but it's a big like change right now. We're today in 2024. It's not about going online and having fun with projects. You are working for other companies to make money off of your free labor, and that has shifted so much. Dude.
It's just made the vibe horrible. But you know what though? Maybe we just figured the secret out. Community is what's going to save open source. They're going to be the only projects that people show up to.
For me personally, I have just shifted to, I'm just going to have fun on the internet. And if other people come have fun with me, it's great. Let's all have fun on the internet. And if interests change, it's okay. And people can come and go, and everyone can still have fun in certain areas, which is again, why I really like Blue Sky, because Blue Sky I have the most fun.
That's true.
It's the place that I'm spending my time, like Twitter and Mastodon and all these other places. I'm like, no, like I'm not having fun there.
It's still weird.
It is very weird.
You know what I mean?
It is
like
very...
it's not like I won't even say corporate. It's not the perfectionist of the internet. It's not where people just show up to just make everybody miserable. Like Twitter, I swear to God, every time a woman that's in tech goes on Twitter, somebody just wants to show up to like have like a pissing contest with you. Like when I go on Blue Sky, I'm like, what weirdness are we getting into?
It is very weird, and it's fun. It's just so strange.
It's so fun. Yes. Yeah. And people are, but they're being their weird self that we all want to be a part of. It's like finding your people, like your community, you know, but like naturally.
And a lot of that comes down to moderation. Right? Because like those are all pieces of this puzzle where Blue Sky has the best individual moderation that exists. And that's what used to be in AOL chat rooms and IRC.
I also think it's just like it's the people that want to get away from the other stuff. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
It's the people that are there, and it's attracting a certain type of people, maybe.
I mean, that is what originally sites like Twitter and Facebook were.
I know. I'm so sad. Like
mean-
I love Twitter. I've met some of like the best. Like it's like just I don't know how to even mourn what Twitter was, because it's like, how do you replicate that?
I mean, Facebook, when Facebook first started launching, I don't remember if it was MySpace was still kind of the hot site. I think it was.
That's how I learned how to code.
Yeah, that's. I mean, a lot of people did.
HTML,
Like you could view source, you could like cut and paste it, and then like modify it to your heart's content. But Facebook was the place you went because your like honestly, like your parents weren't there, your relatives weren't there, like your friends
Yes.
were there.
That's why I love Tumblr and Twitter.
Once like everyone started showing up on Facebook, it was like, okay, we need somewhere new, and that's what Twitter was for the longest time. And then all the advertisements, then the companies started showing up, and then
But I mean, just like open source, you're not writing code for a company for free anymore. All of these social networks turned into, we all realized that we were working for them for free.
Yeah,
We were
we're their
making
content creators.
and that is why I left X. It was Nilay Patel on the Vergecast said, if you are still on X, you are working for Elon Musk for free. And I was like, I will not do that. I cannot.
And you're
do
not
that.
wrong. It's
And-
just like, man, how do we get like? There's no other point where we're all together. There's no other. And the visibility of being able to find other people, like it's such a good way to passively learn things. But now it's
Yeah.
just like, it makes me sad every time I log
They're
on.
all
like, I'm just like,
businesses.
what are they gonna
Yeah.
say now?
And that is where community run things, like you have to have that investment, because IRC servers back in the day, like that was someone's computer in their basement, right? And they just like, I'm the sysadmin for this, I'm going to be on call. And for a lot of people, they don't want to do that anymore, and they don't have time, and that is completely reasonable. The younger generation doesn't know what an open ecosystem's like. Like I'm 40, and like that, like 30 to 40, 50 range, like we had this wave of projects and infrastructure that was open, and we could access those things and we could run them and we could invest our time. Now everything has been closed source. It's all in Instagram and Snap, and that's all closed source systems. But yeah, but all that has shifted. Gareth, where are you spending time and having fun online?
currently I'm spending time, and I don't know if I would say having fun, but I'm spending time on LinkedIn because I'm actively looking for my next adventure in the realm of employment.
And LinkedIn has gotten a little wild too.
LinkedIn. It's funny. I have noticed since looking, and I'm not the only one. A lot of people are looking for their next adventure currently, but I've noticed that the traffic and activity on LinkedIn has definitely picked up. I suspect a lot of that has to do with people who share your feelings and opinions on what's happening with X. But yeah, I've seen a lot of things on LinkedIn that previously I would see in like other. LinkedIn has become more of like a social media than it previously had.
Yeah, I mean, it is still a lot of people that start their post that says "I'm excited to announce." Like that is like still 50% of what I see is people excited, right. and that is so overused and kind of annoying at this point. But yes, I agree.
The ones that get me are the ones where it's like it looks like it's a short couple sentences, and then
you
like
expand
big,
it.
Like, thing, and it's like, oh no, this should have been a blog post that you link to, and then I could decide.
I still think more people should own a website and write a blog. Like just put it out there on a blog post. It doesn't have to be, you can relink it to somewhere else, but like the social media, don't write the content and let it exist in these walled gardens by themselves. That's why I stopped doing my newsletter. I had a newsletter for a long time, and I was like, I don't want all this content trapped in someone's email, because that is the worst place for it to live, because no one's ever going to be able to find it or see it again. And newsletters have all that same problem where it's like, if it doesn't exist online in a searchable open platform on a website, like it's just going to get lost and disappear at some point.
Especially if someone like goes to like, which I'm actually due to do it again, purge your inbox every few months and like get rid of stuff like, okay, I haven't looked at that in like years. I don't need that.
I do think that back in the day, email, right before Gmail, when things were limited to like 10 megs or 100 megs of storage, was actually probably a good thing. Because now that we have infinite storage, it gets abused so much by every newsletter that we never check. And it's just like, hey, you know what? Like limitations have benefits sometimes.
Yep. Yeah, you had motivation to keep your inbox down to a manageable amount now.
Yeah, and not subscribe to every newsletter and not read it, and all these email marketing campaigns and everything else that comes through. It's like, no, like I have 10 megs, like get out of here. Like this is my space.
Right.
MySpace. We're back to MySpace.
MySpace. Yeah. Bring back MySpace.
Garrett, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us all about open source and Salt and your journey there. If anyone is looking, you're on LinkedIn. People can reach out to you, and we'll have a link in the show notes.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.
What's up, friends? I'm here in the breaks with David Shu, founder and CEO at Retool. If you didn't know, Retool is the fastest way to build internal software. So, David, we're here to talk about Retool. I love Retool, you know that. Been a fan of yours for years, but I'm on the outside, and you're clearly on the inside, right? You're on the inside, right?
I think so. Yeah, I'd say so.
Okay, cool. So, given that you're on the inside and I'm not on the inside, who is using Retool, and why are they using Retool?
Yeah. So the primary reason someone uses Retool is typically they are a backend engineer who's looking to build some sort of internal tool, and it involves the front end. And backend engineers typically don't care too much for the front end. They might not know React, Redux all that well, and they say, "Hey, I just want a simple button, simple form on top of my database or API. Why is it so hard?" And so that's kind of the core concept behind Retool. Is front-end web development has gotten so difficult in the past 5, 10, 20 years. It's so complicated today. Put together a simple form with a submit button, have to submit to an API. You have to worry, for example, about, when you press the submit button, you got to bounce it, or maybe you got to disable it when it's, is fetching is true. And then when it comes back, you got to enable the button again. When there's an error, you got to display the error message. There's so much crap now with building a simple form like that. And Retool takes that all away. And so really, I think the core reason why someone would use Retool is they just don't want to build any more internal tools. I want to save some time.
Yeah, clearly the front end has gotten complex, no doubt about that. I think even front enders would agree with that sentiment. And then you have back end folks that already have access to everything, API keys, production database, servers, whatever. But then to just stand up Retool, to me, seems like the next real easy button because you can just remove the entire front end layer complexity. You're not trying to take it away. You're just trying to augment it. You're trying to give developers a given interface, that's Retool, build out your own admin, your own view to a Google Sheet or to the production database, all inside Retool. Let Retool be the front end to the already existing back end. Is that about right?
Yeah, that is exactly right. The way we think about it is we want to abstract away things that a developer should not need to focus on, such that the developer can focus on what is truly specific or unique to their business. And so the vision of what we want to build is something like an AWS, actually, where I think AWS really fundamentally transformed the infrastructure layer. Back in the day, developers used to spend all their time thinking about how do I go rack servers, how do I go manage cooling, manage power supplies, how do I upgrade my database without it going down, how do I change out the hard drive while still being online, all these problems. And they're not problems anymore because nowadays when you want to upgrade your database, just go to RDS, you press a few buttons. And so what AWS did to the infrastructure layer is what we want to do to the application layer, specifically on the front end today. And for me, that's pretty exciting because as a developer myself, I'm not really honestly that interested, for example, in managing infrastructure in a nuts and bolts way. I would much rather be like, hey, I want an S3 bucket, boom, there's an S3 bucket. I want a database, boom, there's a database. And similarly on the front end or in the application layer, there is so much crap people have to do today when it comes to building a simple CRUD application. It's like, you probably have to install 10, 15, maybe even 20 different libraries. You probably don't know what most of the libraries do. It's really complicated. To load a simple form, you're probably downloading almost like a megabyte or two of JavaScript. It's so much crap to build a simple form. And so that's kind of the idea behind Retool is could it be a lot simpler? Could we just make it so much faster? Could you go from nothing to a form on top of your database or API in 2 minutes? Well, we think so.
Yeah, I think so too. So listeners, Retool is built for scale. It's built for enterprise. It's built for everyone. And Retool is built for developers. That's you. You can self-host it, you can run it in the cloud, custom SSO, audit logs, SOC 2 Type 2, professional services. Starting with Retool is simple, fast, and of course, it's free if you want to try it right now. So go to retool.com/changelog. That's retool.com/changelog.
Thank you so much, Gareth, for coming on the show and talking to us all about Salt and generally just open source and foundations. It was a lot of fun.
It was a very appropriate interview for the times of open source that we are currently living in and technology.
Yeah. The world is looking different. We don't know what it's going to look like on the other side, but right now we're in this weird place.
It is. I swear to God, tech is in like the sunken place right now. It's so weird. I'm like, I don't know how this all shakes out.
So for today's outro, we're kind of bringing back a little bit of links of the week, but really it was just, I had a couple links that I wanted to talk about and more broadly than just the links themselves. One of them was called The Serverless Illusion. And this is a very thoughtful piece, not just about serverless. It starts off as what serverless is, but there's one sentence in here that grabbed me so immediately that I had to read more. And it's by Gregor, and he says, illusions happen when abstractions hide relevant concepts and therefore set false expectations. And I had to read that like 4 or 5 times. And so essentially what you're saying is like, hey, we all want to build these abstractions to not deal with the lower level stuff, but sometimes you need the lower level stuff. Sometimes you have to know what's happening under your code, in the server, on the network, something like that. And if the abstraction hides that from you, and says, oh, you don't need to worry about that, I got this, but it actually becomes a problem, then he's calling that an illusion. And I really like how that kind of sets that out as like, oh, if there's something that I need that's 1 layer below me or 2 layers below me, but I can't get to it, then I have this false sense of like, oh, this should just work, and I can't solve it if it doesn't. He goes on to say, like, this isn't just a serverless problem. Like, this is abstractions in general. And this is any platform and even things like Kubernetes. We always try to balance this, like, what is the abstraction we want and need? And what is the access to like lower level knobs that make the platform or the abstraction less abstraction-y, right? There's the more settings you have, the less it looks like an abstraction. But sometimes you need those things.
I don't know how to feel about this. Here's why. Because I feel like we do this thing where we get really excited about the newest technology that's supposed to make our lives easier. And then everybody like jumps on board and puts it in everything and is obsessed with it. And we put it in things we need. We put it in things we don't need. We lose our whole minds about it. And then all of a sudden we turn on it and like cannibalize it and everybody hates it. And it becomes instead of the bandwagon of usage, it becomes the bandwagon of hate. And I don't really think that either are necessary. It's like cloud. Everybody wanted to use it for things we didn't need, but like also what we did need it. And cloud is still like very much useful in its own way. But now it's like, let's do everything on-prem. And you're like, bro, both are valuable. And then now it's like, I don't think everything needs to be serverless, but it's like wild. Like people want it to put serverless everywhere.
Yeah.
And now it's like serverless is bad, and I'm like, it's really not. Like,
well, and I don't think he's not necessarily calling out serverless is the bad thing.
Oh no, I know.
Yeah,
like I his actual sentiment I agree with, but it just seems like it is still somewhat bandwagoning the like, let's eat serverless. Like I think the sentiment that he's saying, we've all been saying. I think that you could apply the same to AI and a bunch of things, you know, like and a lot of like services. But I think you almost have to get a title that people will click on so people will read your stuff. And I think right now it's like, let's all poop on serverless this week. So it's like, that was the cool topic that would make people open the article, but I agree with the sentiment of the article, you know?
The other 2 things he points out was one that I've talked about a lot where like serverless doesn't hide operations. It makes operations part of your application, right? Like it used to be, I had a message queue somewhere else. It's like, oh, I would like the ops team ran the message queue. I didn't want to do that because I was ops stuff. But now you have like EventBridge as part of your application. And it's like, oh, we just pulled the infrastructure into the application. And that is like, just move the infrastructure components around a little bit. And you're like, oh no, which part is actually my app and which part's the infrastructure? And in a more, I would say, truer serverless kind of approach where like, oh, everything should be in like one repo with the application. And I have all these step functions and Lambda and then all these components. Like it's all the infrastructure and app is just one thing. And you can't think of it as like separations of concern, which is also why I see a lot of like enterprises used to have problems adopting serverless because they had an ops team. And when they had like the serverless application developers, like, oh, well, I need a S3 bucket. Like, oh, you got to go talk to the ops team because you don't have access to do that. It's like, well, no, the S3 bucket's part of my app now. Like, I need to have access to those things. And you had to kind of shrink ownership around, like, if it's a serverless application and the infrastructure is part of the app, you have to be able to have access to do the things with it.
I think this is going to get worse though, because the more that we try to do at scale with the least amount of people, like really like automation, AI, all of these things, serverless, all of this is ways to do more with less developers, right? But the more you automate something, the less information you have into how it's automated. So yes, one person can go and automate all these things, but how does everyone else on your team know how it works? How do you like, it's like when that saying when you like over automate and stop documenting stuff, like, and then you don't know how it like works underneath the hood. So yes, it's working for that amount of time, but how do you continue to scale? And it's just like the more we abstract away, people don't know how to run that infrastructure. The more we automate, abstract, the more that we use server, like all these things. But then to a certain extent, like we have to do more with less. So it's like you need those things, but trying to figure out how to utilize them to get more done without handicapping your team is like this constant battle.
That's the balance of like an abstraction versus an illusion, right? Because it's like,
Yeah.
oh, I need access to know what port I'm connecting to, right? Because like some platforms, you just say it's a web server and they figure out the port. But at some point you need to debug it and you're like, oh, actually I needed port 8085. And they're like, oh, well, you don't have access to that. So that piece of it is a problem.
And I think that's going to drastically get worse in the era of AI and firing developers and layoffs because, for one, so much of infrastructure was either abstracted and automated, but those people that built it or applied it knew what it was. And the more that like, and yeah, everything's still running, but eventually you're going to get into the point where it either needs to be redone or modified or fixed. And we're going to continue to try to do more with less. And eventually it will come back to bite us. So I think it's like...
And if you want to talk about a piece of technology that no one knows how it works, like LLMs are like...
That's what I'm saying.
How did this output get here? I don't know.
Be real. We're going to use that, right? And then we're going to have it. Like people are like, we'll have it do security for us. We'll have it build infrastructure. That is a terrible idea because nobody will then know how to fix that infrastructure or why those decisions were made. And then what happens when it doesn't know the answer and it just does something? And then you have a Seb 2. So it's like, it's not that like...
but the Seb 2 is still calling a person. That's the problem.
But the person has no idea how it got there. So it's like,
Seb 2, the robots, and then we'll talk.
It's like you have to pay either way, right? Like, do you want to pay up front and you teach humans and you onboard humans and do that? You can either pay up front or you can pay later. And like I call this the mess around and find out era of tech. We're about to mess around and find out.
That's actually a really good point. Like you don't let LLMs write your code until LLMs can handle your pages, right? Like let's handle that side first. Like, hey, once we send all the pages and they know the run books that are documented and exist and we know how to solve those problems, like send that to the robots first. Let's do that one first and then we'll have them write some code for us.
And when it's their butts on the line to talk to stakeholders when that code goes in the toilet and we don't meet SLAs, you know what I mean? Like it's not that the technology isn't going to be useful, but you still need humans to use it. Like use it to teach humans how to onboard, use it to teach humans how to do that. So you have the best of both worlds. You're making them faster. Maybe you even make them faster to figure out the reason this could be, you know, maybe you make it faster for them to find the solution and on call, but to take humans out of the equation will only hurt you later because
I mean, humans are so, I am so lazy. Like if there is something that's going to automate a portion of that, I'm not going to bother learning it.
But I mean, we have IDEs. There are ways that we can incorporate a way to be more effective, faster, without it taking our ability to know what we're doing. And if
there's a certain amount of automation that is acceptable,
yes.
But like hey, Copilot, write this chunk of code for me, I think is too much, especially for onboarding, right? Because like if it spits out a thing, no one's going to go back through. It's like, oh, which line was that in? It's like my cruise control for my car, right? Like I use it all the time. I'm on the freeway. Guess what? I know how to drive a car.
But I was going to say you had to know how to drive first.
I have learned how to drive the car, and now I can just like go straight.
But think about it. Right now, nobody wants to invest in junior developers. that kind of 1 to 5 year range. Like it's either they don't want people who are really, really expensive, and they don't want people that like either are new or have just enough experience but need to grow to senior. Like, and eventually we will pay for that gap, because if we're not willing to invest in teaching people, AI is not going to solve that problem. And having just the same senior developers, they have to retire at some point. They're not going to be able to scale. So if you're not like investing in the next generation or moving that person who knows some but not all, you know, like it's a cycle. That's the reason why senior engineers have to be good teachers, you know? And the more that we're like, oh, we don't need developers, we don't need to like invest in people, we can get all these things to automate, like until when? So it's like, I think that all of this is kind of going to come home to roost at some point.
I saw a thread recently of someone saying that hiring junior engineers make your senior engineers better because they have to teach.
It is. Have you ever, dude, one of the best ways to learn a complicated thing is to go and teach it to someone else. Like for Millspouse Coders, there was a point where we would have people teach concepts and then record themselves, and we would be like, but we would give an opportunity so they'd have a lightning talk and they could teach it. But we would also do it where it'd be like, explain this to me like I'm a 5-year-old and I don't understand it, because the level of understanding that you have to be at to explain something to someone and answer questions will raise your knowledge on that subject.
That is literally the reason I started doing conference talks. I did my first conference talk back in Scale that I went to. Yeah.
And people always like, or you need to pay your dues first and all this stuff. And I'm like, no, but it's a great way to learn. Just like, that's why people should allow open source people to contribute to the documentation, because your documentation might suck. If you made it and then you have to go tell people how to use it, you know everything about it. But for a new,
the person who wrote the code is the worst one to write the docs.
Thank you. Like you start with a doc, right? And then like you have some, like, dude, I love having somebody, like I'll write a documentation or README or wiki and then have somebody use whatever form of automation or thing that I built and then go through it. And you always find gaps, right? Yep. Because you thought you included that part. And then when they go over it.
And some gaps are intentional, right? Because not every documentation can start from the beginning. And so you have these gaps that are like, hey, if you're here, let's say you're running Kubernetes, we assume you know how to containerize something. Right, like there are assumptions. You have to make some of that, but like those assumptions have to change over time as the industry moves and as abstractions move and hype cycles move. Like some of that has to just adjust to what we should expect someone to be able to do.
Also, the more bigger picture that senior engineers need to be able to operate on, they can't get this full scoping and big picture if they don't remember where people started and how much a junior developer knows, and you know what I mean? So they can properly break down work to give them.
Yeah, and you don't know like what the starting point. I just literally on LinkedIn I put out a message like, anyone that has never used the Talos operating system that I work on, let's do a live stream, because I want to learn from the beginners again. Like if you've never used this before, let's jump on a live stream and I will help you through it. We will make sure we get through the whole thing. And I was looking for 1 or 2 people. I have like 20 streams that are coming. It's amazing. Like this is great because I get to learn from all of the beginners again, because I can't be a beginner.
And you'll make your product better because you're going to find the holes. You're going to find out how to make it better.
Yeah. It's going to help with the docs. It's going to help with command line stuff. It's going to have, so many other things.
And when you do that on a team, the more you are used to onboarding new people and being able to get people up to speed, you make your processes better.
One of the last things I did at Disney Plus was I created a Scala Hello World, because we were mostly a Scala application, and we wrote platforms. Like we wrote the whole platform for all these developers to deploy their applications. And it's okay, here's my GitHub repo. Go deploy it with our tools. You have 4 days. No one did it. No one was like, we had all this automations. We did all the Jenkins stuff. We had deployment pipelines. We had the infrastructure. We had all this stuff. Not a single person completed it in the time limit that I set. And it was like, hey, don't spend all day, 4 days, like, but spend a couple hours on it. You know, like, I want to see how long this takes. We assumed that our tools would allow someone to get up and running and deployed in about 4 hours, and no one did it in 8.
And another thing that also it helps you to get better estimating tasks for your entire team for grooming and planning, because
prioritization.
Exactly. Because if somebody who's been doing it for 20 years and has been on this team for 56 million years, and they wrote all of the infrastructure, automation, and every tool that you've ever had, they're going to do something in a faster level or in faster speed than like everybody else. So if only that one person is scoping everything's always going to take longer, and you're never going to have true estimates. So it's like, I hope we remember the value that new people bring to this industry before we're out of luck. Yeah. Because it's like, dude, like every time you take a gap in that cycle, like you need juniors to become more senior and more senior people to become like, because it keeps like that field alive, and the amount of which we're cutting people and losing that experience, it's going to be sad.
I don't know. I don't know where to go from here. I'll put the links in the show notes for what started this conversation.
I'm gonna go get ice cream. I need something to cheer me up.
So thank you everyone for listening to the episode. If you have someone that you would like to come on the show or a topic you'd like to cover, please email us, shipit@changelog.com. I have a couple people that did email us and I'm already reaching out. It's getting some of those things scheduled. So it's actually great to hear feedback on what other people are interested in, or just like a cool person to talk to. I also really want to talk to people with the what do we call it? Retro episodes of like, if you ran infrastructure in the late 90s or early 2000s, reach out. We have one coming up. I'm gonna tease it right now. It's not gonna be for a little while, but it's about mainframes. I had never touched a mainframe. I want to learn more, and this is gonna be great to hear how it works to like ship code and run a mainframe.
I have also never touched a mainframe. This is very exciting.
I'm excited for it. So if you have some of those retro, or you yourself are interested in coming on and have done old technology that should have been retired a long time ago, please let us know.
You said should have been retired a long time ago. Do you have tech debt?
Is that bash script still running in prod? Reach out to us.
Does anybody know what it does?
No docs.
This is how you know we've gone through too much trauma.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks for listening to Ship It with Justin Garrison and Autumn Nash. Subscribe now if you haven't already. Head to shipit.show for all the ways, or just search for Ship It wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find us. Thanks once again to our partners at Fly.io, to The Mysterious, Breakmaster Cylinder for these dope beats, and to Sentry. Use code CHANGELOG when you sign up and save $100 off their team plan. That's all for now, but come back next week when we continue discussing everything that happens after Git Push.